to Wetbag News. There's a huge new development in the Presidential History Hall of Fame debate and a major decision regarding the casting of an actress to play Sasha Obama in the upcoming 2015 B-list film. And also tonight, Canadian politics just got worse. We learned that Toronto Mayor Rob Ford smoked crack cocaine and didn't resign 2 months ago, showing that no one really cares about Canadian politics. And later, we will take you aboard the Carnival Triumph, as what better way to spend your next vacation than on the cruise that was stranded at sea for 5 days. But we begin tonight with a big announcement in the development of the Presidential Hall of Fame. Today, famed history teacher David Martinez announced the candidates for the new Presidential Hall of Fame set to open this June. It's a massive step to satisfy history shortage across the nation. The question now, which one of the 5 presidential candidates deserves a spot in the Hall of Fame and why? We're bringing in 6 experts today to decide. They'll be taking a look at various aspects of Reagan's presidency. Throughout Reagan's presidency, the center moved closer to Reagan. Reagan upheld family values, portrayed himself as a conservative populist, and proclaimed himself the father of the growing tax revolt. Reagan's actions during his presidency can be divided into 2 categories: domestic policy and foreign policy. At home, Reagan developed Reaganomics, an economic program that revolved around the idea that government intrusion caused economic problems in a free market. One of the most significant portions of Reaganomics was the Tax Reform Act of 1986. Dubbed the biggest tax code overhaul in the nation's history, this act was one of Reagan's most lasting impacts on domestic tax policy. By signing this act, Reagan set the precedent for many modern economic ideals regarding tax burden balancing and distribution. Here is Ms. Gloria Fang's analysis of Reagan's speech on the signing of the Tax Reform Act of 1986.
Flatter rates will mean more reward for that extra effort, and vanishing loopholes and a minimum tax will mean that everybody and every corporation pay their fair share. And that's why I'm certain that the bill I'm signing today is not only an historic overhaul of our tax code and a sweeping victory for fairness, it's also the best anti-poverty bill, the best pro-family measure, and the best job creation program ever to come out of the Congress of the United States.
Reagan emphasizes that his implementation of the new tax reform bill was motivated by fairness. His conviction in the importance of catering to all economic classes displays both his soundness and steadfastness towards domestic affairs. The Tax Reform Act of 1986 was in fact the second of 2 major tax cuts that were part of Reagan's ambitious economic reform plan, which is known as Reaganomics. The first tax cut, the Kemp-Roth tax cut, had been announced during Reagan's 1981 speech to a joint session of Congress on the program for economic recovery. In his 1981 speech, Reagan presented a 4-part program: reducing taxes, cutting government spending, eliminating unnecessary regulations, and pursuing an anti-inflationary monetary policy. His plan placed trust in the marketplace and rewarded entrepreneurial risk-taking while reducing the role of the federal government. Along with benefits for businesses, Reagan held the belief that the benefits of tax reduction would ultimately double as the best anti-poverty bill, the best pro-family measure, and also the best job creation program that was signed into law. Reagan appeals to traditional American ideals in his speech. He asserts the fortitude of the old American spirit, stating that America was founded on faith in the individual and faith in the resources and bounty of each and every separate human soul. He contrasts this positive image of individualism with a negative image of a government hungry for more revenues. Specifically targeting the progressive income tax, Reagan claimed that the steeply progressive nature of the tax was a direct challenge to American ideals, as it punished that special effort and extra hard work that had always been the driving force of our economy. Describing the government as an oppressive hand, Reagan entreats Americans to secure their own economic and political freedoms. By portraying the Tax Reform Act as a way to achieving the American dream, Reagan achieved support for major tax reform.
Also on the domestic front, Reagan faced success in his response to the PATCO strike. By firmly opposing the federally employed air traffic controller strike, Reagan changed the lives and workplaces of current and future employees for the better. Reagan not only upheld federal law that stated that federal employees do not have the right to strike, but also permanently affected the lives of them. Here is Wendy Wang's analysis of Reagan's speech on the PATCO strike.
This morning at 7 a.m., the union representing those who man America's air traffic control facilities called a strike. This was the culmination of 7 months of negotiations between the Federal Aviation Administration and the union.
Hours after the PACO strike began on the morning of August 3, 1981, Reagan conducted a brief press conference holding a question-and-answer session with regards to the PACO strike. In his actions in response to the strike, Reagan not only transformed his presidency, but also the lives of current and future employees. At 7 a.m., approximately 12,000 federally employed air traffic controllers who were members of the Professional Air Traffic Controllers Organization, PACO, went on strike. By striking, they violated a federal law which prohibited federal workers from striking. The strike threatened to shut down all air traffic in the United States. Reagan was a lifetime member of the American Federation of Labor Congress of Industrial Organizations Union. While president of the union, he had led its members into the union's first strike. Because of his former position, Reagan respected the right of workers in the private sector to strike and believed that labor management relationships in the private sector could not be compared to government. However, despite such connection to labor unions, Reagan responded negatively towards the PACO strike. He would not tolerate it. Reagan explains that if the demands of the strikers were met, a tax burden would need to be imposed on other citizens. Reagan found this burden unacceptable. He continued to read aloud the solemn oath taken by each of these employees, a sworn affidavit when they accepted their jobs. I am not participating in any strike against the government of the United States or any agency thereof, and I will not so participate while an employee of the government of the United States or any agency thereof. Reagan concluded his address by stating that those who fail to report for duty this morning are in violation of the law, and if they do not report for work within 48 hours, will have forfeited their job. However, the majority of the striking air traffic controllers did not believe Reagan would actually fire them if they did not report for work within 48 hours, but 48 hours later, the strikers who did not report for work were all fired. This action was risky, but it proved to be one of Reagan's most momentous decisions as it forever changed America's workplace.
As for foreign affairs, Reagan was concerned with the rise of communist powers in the Caribbean island of Grenada. In October 1983, President Reagan sent a small force of Marines to invade the island to prevent the growth of a communist nation in the Americas. This action of containment showed Reagan's desire to preserve and protect the freedom of the United States. Now we will bring in Ms. Tina Liu to analyze Reagan's speech on affairs in Grenada.
Grenada was without a government, its only authority exercised by a self-proclaimed band of military men. There were then about 1,000 of our citizens on Grenada, 800 of them students in St. George's University Medical School. Concerned that they'd be harmed or held as hostages, I ordered a flotilla of ships, then on its way to Lebanon with Marines.
Following the murder of Grenadian Prime Minister Maurice Bishop on October of 1983, Grenada was left without an established government. At this time, 6 Eastern Caribbean nations that possessed limited military forces asked the United States to form an alliance with them to protect Grenada from communism. Reagan agreed the government has a responsibility to go to the aid of its citizens if their right to life and liberty are threatened. This action and rhetoric highlighted Reagan's belief in the freedoms of the individual. Once the American troops landed at Grenada, they discovered a base complete with weapons and communications equipment that indicated that a Cuban invasion of the island was being planned. With this information, Reagan claimed that Grenada was a Soviet-Cuban colony being readied as a military bastion to export terror and undermine democracy. His forceful assertion that the weak nation was close to becoming communist was intended to increase fear in America of communist influences abroad and to justify the invasion of Grenada. Reagan commended the quick action of the forces for immediately seizing the airports to protect the security of both the United States and Grenada. Reagan also noted that a top priority in the invasion was to minimize risk and to avoid casualties on both sides. By including concern over Grenada in his speech, Reagan successfully dispelled the idea of a war-hungry administration. He also stated that in order to honor the soldiers and their sacrifices to preserve the freedom of the United States, we must remain as faithful to the cause of freedom and the pursuit of peace as they have been. By highlighting the sacrifices made, Reagan rallied Americans to unite to protect national security and freedom. Thank you, Tina. Along with events in Lebanon and Grenada, Reagan was also preoccupied with events in Berlin. On June 12, 1987, Reagan delivered his Tear Down This Wall speech at the Brandenburg Gate near the Berlin Wall. Commemorating the 750th anniversary of Berlin, Reagan challenges Soviet Premier Mikhail Gorbachev to tear down the Berlin Wall. Here is Ms. Alice Liu's analysis of Reagan's speech.
General Secretary Gorbachev, if you seek peace, if you seek prosperity for the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, if you seek liberalization, come here to this gate. Mr. Gorbachev, open this gate. Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
Upon arriving in Berlin on June 12, 1987, Reagan delivered his famous Berlin Wall speech at Brandenburg Gate. In his speech, Reagan directly challenged Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev. By asserting that Gorbachev would tear down the Berlin Wall if he sought peace, prosperity, and liberalization, Reagan successfully pushed the Soviet leader to action. Reagan's reiteration of his belief in maintaining peace contradicted the image of a ruthless, anti-communist America. Reagan defended America's vast weapon arsenal, stating, "East and West do not mistrust each other because we are armed because we mistrust each other." While he sounds convinced of the benefits rebirth democracy has created in nations such as the Philippines and those in Central and South America, Reagan was less convinced of the benefits, if any, of Soviet policy. Reagan asserted that the only course the Soviet Union could take to succeed was to make fundamental changes or to face becoming obsolete. Reagan appealed for a peace between the two nations through a mutual arms reduction. This appeal marked a departure from his previous hope that the Soviet economy would be unable to keep up with the increased United States defense spending in the arms race, thus resulting in the collapse of the Soviet Union. Reagan's devotion to arms reduction eventually led to the first successful treaty in history to reduce the nuclear arsenals of both America and the Soviet Union. Reagan's Berlin address was a large step towards the end of the Cold War. On November 9, 1989, East Germany opened the Berlin Wall, and by the end of the year, the wall was dismantled. Reagan's Berlin address drove America and the Soviet Union closer to peace, and ultimately helped to improve the relationship between the two nations.
Reagan was also concerned with protecting the United States. In his speech on national security in 1983, he proposed the creation of the Strategic Defense Initiative, a program that was designed to defend the U.S. against nuclear ballistic missiles. Here is Ms. Brilliant Bow's analysis of Reagan's speech.
My fellow Americans, thank you for sharing your time with me tonight. The subject I want to discuss with you, peace and national security, is both timely and important. Timely because I've reached a decision which offers a new hope for our children in the 21st century, a decision I'll tell you about in a few minutes. And important because there's a very big decision that you must make for yourselves. This subject involves the most basic duty that any president and any people share, the duty to protect and strengthen the peace.
In Reagan's address to the nation concerning national security on March 23, 1983, he proposed the creation of the Strategic Defense Initiative. The program was nicknamed Star Wars, referring to the popular science fiction movie, since it was designed to destroy missiles from space. When put into effect, the concept of mutually assured destruction would break with the transformation of the Cold War into a one-sided war. Despite such ambitions, the SDI was a questionable science which costed billions of dollars and produced few results. Reagan sought to gain support for the SDI by fueling anti-Soviet sentiment among the American public. In his speech, Reagan portrays the Soviet Union as villainous, claiming their use of military power to intimidate. Reagan focuses the audience's attention on a negative yet powerful image of the Soviet Union, pointing to the excessive aggression shown by leaders of the nation. Similarly, in his Evil Empire speech, delivered 15 days prior to his national security speech, Reagan urges America not to ignore the facts of history and the aggressive impulses of an evil empire. By resurfacing Americans' hatred for communists, Reagan was able to re-escalate the Cold War. His demonization of the enemy allowed many of his controversial policies to appear rational. In his speech, he asserts that the Soviets have built up a massive arsenal of new strategic weapons that can strike directly at the United States. Reagan had wanted to portray himself in a positive light. He wanted to project an image of a man devoted to freedom, democracy, and justice in the world. Though he commonly relied on American emotions, Reagan also cited favorable data to convince the public to believe that his proposals were right. He reasons in his speech that, since 1969, the Soviet Union has built 5 new classes of intercontinental ballistic missiles and upgraded these 8 times. By highlighting the contrast between the Soviet production of forces and the U.S. production of forces, Reagan created a sense of U.S. deficiency to increase support for the SDI. Such rhetoric greatly reinforced the President's position and strengthened support.
Thank you, Brilliant. Reagan delivered his last official speech from the Oval Office on January 11, 1989, by bidding farewell to the nation with his farewell address. Reagan points out that the changes made during his presidency is not to be attributed to himself, but rather to the people. Also, he conveyed the idea of new patriotism throughout the people and made sure citizens were true to their country. Here is Ms. Isha Lawless' analysis of Reagan's farewell address.
The American people. You won every battle with every call you made and letter you wrote demanding action. Well, action is still needed. If we're to finish the job, Reagan's regiments will have to become the Bush brigades. Soon he'll be the chief. and he'll need you every bit as much as I did. Finally, there is a great tradition of warnings in presidential farewells, and I've got one that's been on my mind for some time. But oddly enough, it starts with one of the things I'm proudest of in the past 8 years, the resurgence of national pride that I called the new patriotism.
Before Reagan left office, he, like his predecessors, delivered a farewell address to the nation. His farewell address demonstrated not only his public speaking abilities, but also his remarkable connection with the people. In his final speech as president, Reagan talked about how the individual people were the main source for most of the change brought to the country during his term. Reagan asserted with his typical charisma, "You won every battle with every call you made and every letter you wrote demanding action." Reagan brought about the notion that government could not and should not be relied upon to solve every problem. Rather, the people were instrumental to change. But the accomplishment Reagan was proudest of in the past 8 years was the growth of new patriotism. Reagan purports the idea that positive, genuine feelings in America won't last unless they are grounded with thoughtfulness and knowledge. Reagan advocated informed patriotism and asked the nation to consider if they were doing a good enough job teaching our children what America is and what she represents in the long history of the world. Reagan warned America to preserve its freedoms. He implored the nation to remember that its freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of enterprise, and freedom is precious and rare. With this warning in mind, Reagan asserted that he didn't want any generation to take America for granted. Instead, he wanted informed patriotism to be present in each American. Following Reagan's words, if we, as Americans, do not take pride in our country and do not realize what it means to be an American, America as a whole will lose its direction and cease to be. Aside from policymaking, Reagan also personally responded to thousands of letters while in office. These letters reveal much about Reagan's character. He defends many of his policies within these letters, firmly standing behind every action. Throughout his presidency, Reagan was especially known for his extraordinary public speaking skills. Reagan attributes much of the success during his terms to Americans rather than himself, stating that changes would not have been made if it weren't for the people. Reagan attempted to connect with Americans. He personally wrote numerous speeches that he delivered with great enthusiasm and feeling, instead of relying on a speechwriter. Reagan once received a letter sent by John McClary, a writer from Vermont, who had offered to be Reagan's speechwriter. In response to McClary's letter, Reagan explained, "You see, for most of the years I have been speaking, I have been the speechwriter. I have always dug up my own facts and material and done my own speechwriting." Reagan had politely turned down McClary's offer because he preferred to use his own words and evidence so he could develop a better relationship with the audience. He went on to write, "I would hate to impose upon you a draft of the speech you've offered, knowing that there wouldn't be too many opportunities for future writing on a professional basis." Reagan understood that if he hired a professional speechwriter to write his drafts for him, he would end up not using them. Reagan concluded his letter to McClary by stating, "But again, let me thank you for your kindness in volunteering to do this." Though Reagan appreciated McClary's offer to help, he refused to accept it. However, he later appointed McClary to serve on his domestic policy staff.
During his 1980 campaign for presidency, Reagan made an effort to win the votes of the women in the nation. He promised that, if elected, he would appoint women to his cabinet and appoint the first female justice to the Supreme Court. Reagan fulfilled his campaign promise by appointing Sandra Day O'Connor as a Supreme Court justice. Before she served on the Supreme Court, O'Connor served as a judge in Arizona and the first female majority leader of a state senate in America. The decision to appoint O'Connor was controversial not only because she was female, but also because of her pro-choice stance. Though Reagan held a firm belief that abortion was immoral, he still believed he had made the right decision to appoint O'Connor. He addresses the issue of abortion in his letter to Republican Penny Pullen, who believed Reagan had made a mistake in his appointment of O'Connor. In the letter, he clarifies that he is not weakened in his belief that interrupting a pregnancy means the taking of a human life. Reagan references hearings in Congress which attempted to establish when life actually begins, explaining that those hearings did nothing but strengthen his conviction regarding this taking of a human life. He believes that simple humanity suggests that we opt for life until someone can definitely prove that life does not exist. Closing the letter, Reagan takes full responsibility of the appointment of O'Connor by repeatedly claiming, "If there has been a mistake in this appointment, then the mistake would be mine." Reaffirming his conviction that there was no mistake made in appointing O'Connor, Reagan explains that he gave a great deal of study before appointing Judge O'Connor and is confident he made the right decision. In his letter, Reagan empathizes with Poland and her views on abortion, but continually repeats that he does not regret O'Connor's appointment to the Supreme Court despite her views, and hopes that Poland would have no regrets about it as well. Throughout his presidency, Reagan's opinion on abortion remained strong.
The platform Reagan campaigned on for the presidency primarily focused on restoring the United States economy and restoring the nation's defense capabilities. Those goals held constant when he became president, becoming his top priorities throughout both of his terms. However, Reagan realized that there were other issues in the nation, explaining that sometimes it seems that I'm a juggler with at least 15 balls in the air. Prior to Reagan's presidency, federal spending directed towards domestic programs substantially increased throughout the 1960s and 1970s. By the time Reagan took office in 1981, federal spending for domestic programs was greater than 50% of the federal budget, while federal spending for national defense was less than 25%. The majority of the domestic federal budget was spent on Social Security and Medicare. A major event that occurred during Reagan's first year as president was the Professional Air Traffic Controllers Organization PATCO strike. In response to Mrs. Browning's letter wondering why her son, one of the PATCO strikers, was fired, Reagan explained that though the right to strike was an inalienable right for public employees, the same did not hold for federal employees like the PATCO strikers. Reagan's firing of almost 12,000 strikers was fair. He did not fire them immediately. Shortly after the strike began, he issued a warning to the strikers, stating that they would be fired if they did not report back to work within the next 48 hours. Additionally, exceptions were made for workers who did not receive word of Reagan's mandate. Reagan asserts in the letter that he had no choice but to fire the strikers because enforcing the law is his job as president.
Throughout his 2 terms as president, Reagan placed a tremendous amount of emphasis on national security and military strength. In his notably blunt foreign policy speech during his 1976 presidential campaign, Reagan stated that humanitarian impulses and benevolence are commendable and they have a place, but our strength and survival come first. To Reagan, peace would be attainable only if the United States displayed an unmatchable level of military prowess. Reagan's straightforward approach to the relationships between the United States and the Soviet Union can be ascribed to his conviction that the simplest solutions to foreign conflicts were the most effective. Reagan pushed forward his plan for winning the Cold War by dividing it into several simple hypotheses. Reagan believed that because the Soviet economy had a weak foundation, it would be unable to sustain a technology race with the United States. According to Reagan, the only source of the Soviet power's legitimacy in Eastern European countries was the influence of communism. Following these theories, Reagan engaged in numerous efforts to achieve a meaningful reduction in armaments from strategic, nuclear, to conventional, as reaffirmed in many of his letters. On July 9, 1981, Reagan confronted growing criticisms that he did not clearly define the outlines of his plan in a letter to Mr. John O. Kohler. In it, he stated, "I have a foreign policy. I'm working on it. I just don't happen to think that it's wise to always stand up and put in quotation marks in front of the world what your foreign policy is." Reagan asserted that he believed in quiet diplomacy, which entailed more covert forms of negotiation. In 1983, tensions between the United States and the Soviet Union rose dramatically. The nuclear freeze movement continued to develop, and the United States deployed intermediate-range nuclear forces in Europe, and the Soviet Union walked out of the nuclear weapon talks in Geneva. However, this turbulent year also revealed noticeable results of Reagan's quiet diplomacy. Reagan's private negotiations with Soviet General Secretary Yuri Andropov proved successful when refugees in the American embassies in Moscow were released. In Reagan's October 1984 letter to a new immigrant, Ms. Veschenko, he mentioned the success of a little quiet diplomacy in allowing people like Veschenko to be released from the foreign embassy and admitted into the United States. These letters highlighted key distinctions established between his public rhetoric and his private efforts.
Reagan believed that peace in the Middle East was the highest priority of the United States and its allies. Because of this belief, when the Abu Nidal terrorist group, formerly affiliated with the PLO, shot Israel's ambassador to Great Britain in 1982, Israel invaded southern Lebanon to stop PLO terrorists from raiding Israel. In a letter to his close friend Lawrence Bailenson regarding Israel's attack on Lebanon, Reagan expressed his support for Israel. He explained his goals in the Middle East: to remove the PLO, to unify Lebanon, to make the northern border of Israel safe, and to bring peace to the Middle East as a whole. Reagan believes that the United States has made considerable progress in Lebanon. In his letter, Reagan firmly states America's pledge to the continued existence of Israel as a nation. Israel wished to maintain a military presence on Lebanon's side of the border because it felt threatened by the invasion of PLO forces at its northern border. Reagan writes that the United States expressed its willingness to help Lebanon with its own national forces until Lebanese forces were capable of defending the border by themselves. As a further effort to restore order in the region, Reagan looks to persuade Israel, Syria, and the PLO to give the Lebanese a chance to re-establish sovereignty of their land. Reagan asserts that United States efforts in Lebanon have been successful, despite some media reports. He reaffirms that the United States has and always will stand by Israel as a nation. While justifying Israel's actions as a defensive precaution, Reagan does make it clear that Lebanon was responsible for maintaining its own borders against the PLO. Reagan also remarks that the replacement of Ariel Sharon with Moshe Arens as defense minister in Israel is a positive step towards peace in the region. However, this success proved to be temporary, as within a few weeks of writing the letter, a terrorist attack killed 17 Americans at the U.S. Embassy in Beirut.
Reagan had a substantial amount of respect for those who served in the military, especially because he himself had served in the military prior to entering politics. Reagan began his military career on April 29, 1937, when he enlisted in the Army Enlisted Reserve. He started off as a private of Troop B in the 322nd Cavalry in Des Moines, Iowa, and was quickly appointed to the 2nd Lieutenant in the Officer Reserve Corps of the Cavalry. Reagan's military abilities were quickly recognized, and, as a result, he was ordered to active duty. Unfortunately, his poor eyesight restricted him to limited service only. Unable to serve overseas, he eventually transferred to the Army Air Forces. In the AAF, Reagan was promoted to captain of the 1st Motion Picture Unit. While on active duty, Reagan served as personnel officer, post adjutant, and executive officer. When Reagan became commander-in-chief of the armed forces, his regard for the military did not change. In his letter to Mr. Samuel B. Chalmer Jr., Reagan explains how he came to return the military salute as president. Throughout his letter, Reagan expresses uncertainty about his standing in relation to the military. From his previous military experience, Reagan knew that if on active duty or in civilian clothes, a military salute is not to be returned. He writes that when confronted with the matter, his arm would stiffen every time, almost automatically coming up. Upon his encounter with 4-star General Robert Barrow, Reagan points out the impact the general's insightful words had on him. The simple sentence, "Mr. President, I think if you did it, no one would complain," allowed Reagan to realize that patriotism would not be questioned or protested by anyone. Throughout the remainder of his presidency, Reagan consistently regarded the United States military with his highest respect and utmost pride.
And now to Isha Lala in Edison, New Jersey, with interviews of people's opinions on Reagan.
Thanks, Tina. Today I'm out to find what people really think about President Reagan. Personally, I think he was too contradictory in his speech and his policy. There was a recession in the early 1980s after Reaganomics was implemented, and he increased the federal deficit. Additionally, he proved unsuccessful foreign affairs. Let's see how my day goes. Okay, let's find some people. Excuse me, miss.
Yes?
May I ask you a few questions about President Reagan?
Yes, of course.
What do you think about the Gorbachev and Reagan encounter?
Please, don't even get me started on Reagan. Oh, I don't even understand why people like him so much. Like, honestly, Reagan misled people all the time. He was definitely the great communicator in that sense. Throughout his entire political career, he said, "Oh, I'm so against communism," and then he goes to meet with Gorbachev. I really just don't get it. This completely contradicted his anti-communist stance. Am I the only one who remembers this? And don't even get me started on his lies about domestic affairs. He promised to reduce America's deficit, but then he went back on his word. The deficit was not even lowered or maintained. Not to mention the fact that he's considered a saint in the Republican Party. Even historian Stephen Ambrose agrees with me. He himself said that. What does anyone see in Reagan anyways? He was nothing more than an actor.
So you think Reagan's a bad president? Shouldn't be inducted at all?
Excuse me? I wasn't finished. Rude much? But I guess Reagan did do some good things. He did reduce federal programs to decrease the power of the federal government and force states and cities to take more responsibility for their citizens. Not to mention the fact that he increased the defense buildup and reduced taxes and helped to end the Cold War. And also, he did deal with the PACO strike, sign the INF Treaty, and expand the war on drugs. And he had reformed the Republican Party. And he did create Reaganomics, which I suppose led to the longest period of economic expansion from 1982 to 1989. But besides that, no. I think he was an awful president.
Oh, thank you for your time.
You're welcome!
Excuse me, miss. May I please have some of your time?
Oh yeah, sure. It's not like I wasn't talking to a big business CEO or anything.
Oh, great. What do you think about our 40th president?
Oh, excuse me. Hold this for a second, please. Well, I don't think that Reagan handled his foreign affairs very well, but he did have some success. Like the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, and he did have a lot of success in Grenada too, and he also ended the Cold War, so that really benefited America. But he didn't really succeed in Lebanon, and the Iran-Contra scandal really hurt his credibility. But he did leave office with a 70% approval rating, and being nicknamed the Great Communicator, he connected to America, the American citizens very well. but I never doubted that he would pull us through the tough times.
Oh, I see you've studied a lot about Reagan's presidency.
But of course, I did double major in political sciences and business.
Oh, okay. I see. What do you think about Reagan overall?
He was a great president overall. His foreign policy could have been much better, though. I remember while reading his biography, President Reagan, The Role of a Lifetime by Luke Cannon. Luke Cannon would always say, if a president is unwilling to pursue foreign policy will pursue him. And that's pretty much what happened with Reagan. But Cannon also mentioned that Reagan was very, very committed to his decisions, and he was a great American who held a compelling vision of his country. And Reagan was flawed, but that's probably what made him human, and that's what benefited America.
Okay, great. Have a nice day.
Thank you.
Excuse me? Is this the famous Brilliant Val, conservative senator from Texas?
Yes, ma'am. What can I help you with?
First off, can I please get your opinion on the Bridgegate scandal?
You all are ridiculous. I can't believe this. I'm not going to answer any more of your questions of it. I'm so tired of this.
Sorry?
Oh, I beg your pardon, ma'am. It's just that this Bridgegate scandal is really strange. Now look here, did you know this scandal has received 17 times the amount of media coverage over the past 24 hours than the IRS scandal did over the past 6 months on the big three networks? Now no more of this.
Oh, okay. May I please get your opinion on President Ronald Reagan?
Sure thing, ma'am. What would you like to know?
Well, how has he influenced you?
Well, clearly he's influenced most of my political thinking. I strive to defend the right of the individual to be a citizen crusader like President Reagan. It's like Mr. Goldwater said in his 1860 book, the conscience of a conservative is pricked by anyone who debates the dignity of an individual human being.
Well, from what I've heard, Reagan was very misleading. Misleading and lying are sort of Republican, trademarks.
Okay, now you listen here. I'm only going to say this once. Reagan did much to help conservatives move past anti-conservative sentiment in the nation. He helped conservatives move past racism, McCarthyism, bigotry, and the Watergate scandal. Reporters rank Ronald Reagan too low. Like historian William Pemberton said, Reagan's victories in the tax and budget fights, his success in the PATCO strike, and his defense buildup all contribute to his lasting public reputation for courage, boldness, strength, and competence.
Sorry, Miss Bell, I meant no offense.
No, it's just that Reagan was not lazy. He provided such clear and emphatic ideological direction that his subordinates could make decisions and lead.
But what about the Iran-Contra scandal? He lied to the people.
Well, what would you have done? Would you have sacrificed your own credibility to try and recover your own citizens? No, I didn't think so. At least Reagan confessed. Obama didn't even have the strength to confess. Christie confessed to the Bridgegate scandal. I don't know what you reporters all hate. Is it the IRS targeting Republican groups? Is it the Benghazi terror attack? Or maybe it's the failed rollout of Obamacare? Maybe it's the NSA spying on foreign government leaders? Or maybe it's the Fast and Furious operation? Besides, Reagan accomplished a lot more than President Obama. He did, after all, have success in the tax cuts, and he had success in the defense buildup, and he succeeded in getting arms reductions, and he reduced the budget for many liberal programs. So Reagan was a symbol of free economics. He put a conservative up in the federal judiciary. He helped provide stability to the middle class, and he gave the nation optimism for a future of peace and prosperity. He brought pride to the Republican Party, and he brought pride to the nation. Do you have any more questions?
So you don't approve of the government?
Please, ma'am, I run better than the government.
While I have your attention, may I ask you a couple of questions?
Sure.
What's your opinion on Ronald Reagan?
Well, I thought he was a good president, above average, but not the best.
Oh, can you please elaborate on this?
Well, to begin, Reagan oversaw a lot of phenomenal things during his presidency. For example, like historian Carl Olesker said, Reagan's economic policy, known as Reaganomics, was the catalyst behind a fundamental shift in the fiscal policy that is widely supported today in the political community. But at the same time, Reagan increased the deficit, which he regretted. As Reagan predicted, the federal spending has increased. The Iron Triangle has continued. Federal revenues grow, federal spending grows, and federal deficit grows. For Reagan, federal revenues had increased by 21%, but federal spending had increased more.
So where do you think the nation is headed after 20 years that Reagan has left office?
Well, Reagan was right. Federal spending has definitely increased. America needs to break the Iron Triangle before the Iron Triangle breaks America.
Okay, thank you so much for your time.
No problem.
Now we're going to ask someone about President Reagan.
No.
Hi, may I please ask you a couple of questions?
I don't want questions.
No, but it's regarding President Reagan.
Wait, Reagan? You mean this guy? I love Reagan!
Oh, cool. What do you think about our 40th president?
Okay, I need to get my glasses on. So, Reagan. Such good times. Well, I hope that you've noticed that I'm obviously his biggest fan.
Yeah, I see that, obviously.
Okay, well, before I go on that tangent, okay, I'd like to mention his incredible personality. He was always known for his quick thinking, his humor, and especially his public speaking. Whenever he goes on public appearances, he always radiates a sense of confidence, and it's wonderful.
I see. So, what about his foreign policy? What did you think about that?
Foreign policy, well, I don't even know how to start. I don't know if this is due to influence from the media, but he always seems to be like a superhero during his foreign affairs, everywhere, like in the world. In 1987, he tore down the Berlin Wall, and he helped to liberate millions of Europeans from bordering nations, from communism. And he also put an end to the Cold War, the Cold War that's been lasting for 40 years. It's mind-blowing. So I remember this one article by this one scholar I read in the newspaper, the Sunday paper, and his name is Edwin Mies, and he nicknamed the president Champion of Freedom, and he called him the Champion of Freedom because he helped so many people survive, and he liberated them from communism.
Oh. After today, I learned a lot about President Reagan. I still believe that he had a lot of flaws, but like many people have told me, I think these flaws prove that he was human. Like what historian Chester J. Park said, one of Reagan's best qualities was his public speaking. His clear speech helped him retain his popularity, even when his policies didn't work out. Despite the recession, Reagan did end up presiding over the longest period of economic expansion during peacetime because of Reaganomics. While he may have lacked in some parts of foreign policy, he helped end the Cold War and was successful in Grenada. Reagan made Americans proud of their nation. He taught the nation to expect the unexpected, and helped the nation become more responsive in all aspects. And in the end, he taught us all one valuable lesson. America is too great for small dreams.